Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. The United Kingdom is way out front. Australia is in second, followed close behind by Ghana. China has joined the fray, coming in around the middle of the back of the pack. David Subith sent me an idea for a show. At first, I considered the mystery mostly solved when Michael's boat sunk and he washed ashore in New Guinea. The locals invited him to dinner as the main course. In the 60s, the folks living in New Guinea were still eating people. Strangers weren't exactly welcome to their tribes. Anybody not from the village was considered an enemy, and a white guy washing ashore would be just another person. It mattered not at all how much money he had. To the tribe, money wasn't a thing. That's what I thought at first. New Guinea was run by Australia for 60 years until they got their independence in 1975. English was spoken by most people living in or around the cities, but the folks living in the deepest parts of the jungle spoke Hirimatu, which, depending on the tribe, had several dialects. To understand what might have happened, you have to know the backstory. Here are some of what people are saying about the multi-million-dollar family. The Rockefeller dynasty began during the Civil War, when cheap booze was sold to the soldiers even when they were about to go into battle. Just what we needed, drunk soldiers. Being a family of wealth, the politicians turned a blind eye. John Rockefeller began loaning money to people who needed a quick handful of cash. He charged high interests, and he had little sympathy for those who couldn't pay. Usury is the practice of making unethical or immoral monetary loans that unfairly enrich the lender. In the U.S., usury laws capped interest rates at 6% until 1916, when certain banks were allowed to charge up to 36%. Gee, I wonder why. Politicians getting rich, maybe? A group of businessmen were building a railway, and Rockefeller offered them a loan at a reasonable rate. He loaned them $420,000. 2 months later, Rockefeller acted as if he needed the money back right away to cover some bad debts. He told these businessmen they had 24 hours to come up with the money that he had loaned them. Well, these men scrambled to get a bank loan to repay Rockefeller, but the banks had all been told that these men's credit was no good. Told by who? Well, Rockefeller was who. No bank would loan them the $420,000 they needed, so the businessmen were forced to sell the railroad at a hugely reduced rate. Rockefeller took over the railroad for something like 5 cents on the dollar. 1913, John Rockefeller used his money to help create and fund the Federal Reserve, along with the Rothschilds, which gave these families the ability to print money even though there was no gold to back it up. This put them well above the U.S. government in terms of power and influence, and power over the people of the United States by loaning us our own money at interest. Rockefeller was anti-union. Workers were there to make him money, and it didn't matter if they were paid as little as possible for the maximum amount of work. In 1914, coal miners in Ludlow, Colorado decided they'd had enough and they went on strike. Rockefeller had a controlling interest in the coal mines of Colorado, so he told the governor, "Send in the troops." The Colorado National Guard, along with private security agents, marched on the miners and their families who were camped in front of the mine. The soldiers began shooting into the assembled men, women, and children. A machine gun had been set up above the encampment, and it was indiscriminately spraying bullets into the crowd. An untold number of men were killed, along with 55 women and children. The press reported only 25 dead, mostly mine workers. The National Guard soldiers and the mine guards were all arrested. But they were quickly released. All charges were dropped. After the Ludlow massacre, the Rockefellers needed all the good publicity that money could buy. They hired a publicist and they started up a magazine. They used their money to publish their own pamphlets to sing high praise on the good that they brought to America and not say a thing about all the bad things. They joined forces with the Hearst Publishing Company in 1915, putting out only positive articles on Rockefeller, and they demonized anybody who said anything bad about them. They were publicly accused of printing fake news and providing the public with false information. Wait a minute, isn't that kind of the same thing that's going on today? If you talk about certain subjects, you get locked out of all the platforms. I talk about First Amendment. Rockefeller began pouring money into the school system, saying he didn't want a nation of thinkers, he wanted a nation of workers. Ever wonder why our school system is so screwed up? Rockefeller got into oil production. He would sell oil for less than it took to produce it. If it cost $8 a barrel to produce a barrel of oil, he would sell it for $7. This drove all the competition out of business. Once everybody was gone and he had control of all oil production in the area, Rockefeller ran the price way up to make massive profits. Having a monopoly was illegal, but cash was handed out to the folks in Congress, so they all turned a blind eye to what was going on. Well, finally, Standard Oil was told they could no longer control the market. The company was broken up into several smaller companies that were all run by friends and families of the Rockefellers. Oil production created a lot of byproducts that were mostly just waste. Some chemists began looking into ways to use this stuff. Somebody discovered you could make drugs out of petroleum. Well, most doctors didn't much care for these new drugs since there were plenty of natural products to treat patients with. So Rockefeller began financing medical schools, telling the new doctors to hand out pills like Halloween candy. Treat the symptoms, not the illness. Mask what was making people sick, and you would have a customer for life. If you cured them, well, they would go away once they were better. As kids grew up, they tend to admire their folks. Sometime around their teen years, they usually rebel a bit, thinking they now have all the answers. Some rich folks sometimes buy their kids' affection. Rich kids don't go to public schools because their folks know they won't learn all the things needed to succeed in business. Most kids learn just enough to say, "You want fries with that?" To add to the mess of life, kids are brainwashed into going to college and amassing enormous student debt so they can start life out owing more money than they'll ever make. Sounds like a good plan, doesn't it? Michael Clark Rockefeller was born in 1938, along with his twin sister, Mary. He was the youngest son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He grew up with a silver spoon, well, probably a gold spoon. He was sent to the best schools. He was being groomed to take his place in the family dynasty. After graduating from Harvard in 1860, he joined the Army as a private. Yes, the son of the richest man on the planet was a lowly private in the U.S. Army. I wonder if his drill sergeants thought of him. Did they bust his chops like most recruits, or did they worry about possible ramifications from his dad and go light on him? 6 months was all that he could take. After being in there for half a year, Michael decided he'd had enough and he wanted to do something else. As a college graduate and the son of a millionaire, he could have gone to officer candidate school, but he went in as a private. Michael wanted to see what else was out there, so he went back to college and began working with anthropologists and folks like that. He wanted to know more about the world and art. Though his father expected him to follow in his footsteps and help manage the family's vast business empire, Michael was a quiet, artistic spirit. He wanted to do something more exciting than sit around a boardroom and conduct meetings. Making money wasn't his thing. He joined the Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology to study the Guinee tribe of Western Netherlands, New Guinea. No country should have 4 words in their name, but Western Netherlands, New Guinea. United States of America. No, never mind. The expedition filmed something called Dead Birds, which was the name of an ethnographic documentary movie produced by Robert Gardner. Michael Rockefeller, was the sound recordist. He and a friend briefly left the expedition to study the Asmat tribe of southern Netherlands, New Guinea. After returning home from the Peabody expedition, Rockefeller returned to New Guinea to study the Asmat and collect their art. The Dani tribe that Michael had studied and lived with were mostly peaceful farmers. They were a lot different from the Asmat tribe, who were headhunters and cannibals. Michael had been with both tribes on many occasions. I'll try to clear up a little bit of confusion here. Holland is not a country. It's a part of the Netherlands. The Dutch are a Germanic ethnic group of a nation native to the Netherlands. They share a common ancestry and culture, and they speak the Dutch language. Just about everybody in the United States referred to as being Dutch are actually German, as in Deutschland. The Lost Dutchman was German. Pennsylvanian Dutch were German. In 1660 treaty, the Dutch East India Company recognized the Sultanate of Tidor's supremacy over the Papuan people, the inhabitants of New Guinea. Tidor never exercised actual control over the interior and the highlands of New Guinea. In 1872, Tidor recognized Dutch sovereignty and granted permission to the Kingdom of the Netherlands to establish administration in its territories whenever the Netherlands Indians authorities wanted to do so. This allowed the Netherlands to legitimize a claim that over the New Guinea area. In 1942, most parts of the Netherlands Indies were occupied by Japan. Behind Japanese lines in New Guinea, Dutch guerrilla fighters spied on and fought the Japanese soldiers. During the occupation, the Indonesian national movement went through a rapid development. After Japan's surrender, Sukarno issued the Proclamation of Indonesian Independence, which was to encompass the whole of the Netherlands Indies. The ethnic diversity of Indonesia was initially discussed at two conferences in Milano and some town in Indonesia, Pangkalpinang. My listeners in Indonesia, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but I have a hard enough time with English. During the Pangkalpinang Conference, the right of self-determination of the Eurasian Chinese and Arab ethnic minorities was discussed. This conference stipulated specific territories would have special relations with the Kingdom of the Netherlands if they wanted to. A Netherlands plan was to divide Indonesia into several federal states with possible autonomous areas. The whole would be called the United States of Indonesia and would remain linked to the Netherlands in the Netherlands-Indonesian Union. The Indonesian side agreed to this plan during the Linggadjati Conference in November 1946. 1949, when the rest of the Dutch East Indies became fully independent as Indonesia, the Dutch retained sovereignty over Western New Guinea and took steps to prepare it for independence as its own country. Tensions regarding the Dutch-Indonesian dispute over Dutch New Guinea escalated in December 1957, following Indonesia's defeat in the UN General Assembly in 1957 to pass a resolution in favor of Indonesia's claim to the territory. Everybody wanted this one small island just beyond Australia. Sukarno responded by allowing the seizure of Dutch enterprises operating in Indonesia and announced the intended expulsion of Dutch residents from the country. The increased tensions surrounding the dispute encouraged the Dutch to accelerate their plans to move the disputed territory towards an act of self-determination. In 1962, Indonesia launched a significant campaign of airborne and seaborne infiltration against the disputed territory. Facing mounting international diplomatic pressure and the prospect of an Indonesian invasion force, the Dutch conceded and re-entered negotiations and agreed to a proposal from 1962 for the staged transition from Dutch to Indonesian control being administered by the UN. Talk about a wasted effort. The agreement was signed in 1962 at the UN headquarters in New York, and the territory was placed under the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority in October. It was subsequently transferred to Indonesia in 1963. Now, did I clear up anything, or did I just confuse matters worse? The territory formally became part of Indonesia in 1969 after the Indonesian government who shifted to New Order under President Suharto starting from 1966. From 1971, the name Papua New Guinea was used for the Australian territory. September 1975, Australia granted full independence to Papua New Guinea. During all of these changes in government, parts of New Guinea were still inhabited by tribes that lived the same way they had for hundreds of years. Just because somebody in New York City makes a declaration that somebody in Indonesia is running the country, well, the folks living out in the brush could care less. If they didn't see it right there in their own tribe, they just simply ignored it. 1961, when Michael Rockefeller was planning his adventures, the island was under the control of the Netherlands. Michael had enough money he could have bought the best boat available. After all, he was the son of the richest man on the planet. Instead, he either built or he hired a dugout catamaran. He intended to sail around New Guinea and map out locations to land and investigate the locals. He wanted to build up a working relation with them and purchase or trade for their artwork, which he would then take back to New York and put on display in a museum. Now, it gets really confusing when you start looking into a lot of these events from the past, because there are so many people out there who wrote so many books on the subject, and each of them wants to further their own idea as to what happened. So if you read one website or one book, it says one thing, and you read another one and it says completely different thing. So, did Michael build the boat he sailed in, or did he buy it, or was he simply renting it? We don't know, because like I said, a lot of different people with different ideas. In November 1961, Michael had a Dutch anthropologist, Rene Wassing, and 2 teenage locals with him. I listened to the expanded perspectives talking about Michael's misadventure. They said the 4 men were in a motorboat. I looked at several other reports, and none of them agreed with each other. Some said Michael was alone. Others said that the 4 were in a small sailboat. The number of people and the type of conveyance isn't all that important. What is important is what happened as the boat was following the coastline. At the mouth of the Betz River, the boat was hit by some powerful waves that capsized it. The 4 men managed to pull themselves up onto the underside of the boat. There was now no way of steering or controlling the vessel. The 2 locals said they were going to swim to shore, which was between 5 and 9 miles. Can you imagine swimming 9 miles? And then they were going to walk back to town to get help. Now, these locals lived on the water, so they were used to doing things like this, but that's what the story says. The 2 teenagers jumped in the water and swam off, and this left just the 2 white guys bobbing in the waves. They spent the entire night in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, waiting for help. When the sun came up, Michael decided he was no longer going to wait. He took some salvaged parts of the boat to use as flotation device and headed to shore. The last thing Rene Wassing heard him was, he said, "I think I can make it." Later on that same day, the rescue party arrived and they picked up Wassing. They motored to the coast and they yelled for Michael, but they received no response. After spending as much time as they could, the rescuers returned to town to report the disappearance of the son of one of the richest men on earth. A New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller, and Michael's twin sister Mary flew to New Guinea to be on hand as a massive search took place. The Dutch authorities were in charge. Rockefeller could only sit and watch. I'm sure he used his position as governor to put pressure on Washington, to put pressure on the Netherlands, to put pressure on the folks in New Guinea to work harder. As sitting in a luxury hotel and yelling at people in the jungle to search harder isn't going to accomplish much. The people in the field would do what they could, but searching for someone who may or may not have even made it to shore is hard work. Starting from the location of the boat where Michael dove in and working towards land, the search area would have been extensive. Keep in mind this was the 60s. New Guinea wasn't all that well advanced. Equipment could be brought in from Australia, but everything had to be negotiated through the Netherlands. No body, living or dead, was found. After spending weeks looking, the search was called off. It was assumed, and you know what happens when you assume, that Michael had drowned somewhere between the boat and the island. Maybe a shark had encountered him and there was nothing left to be found. Sharks don't really like to eat people. I guess we taste funny to them. They will usually take a bite to see what we taste like and then go looking for something better to eat. The folks living along the shore where Michael disappeared did like to eat people. A theory began to circulate that Michael had made it to shore only to be found by the Asmat, killed and eaten. The Asmat had a belief that life and death had to stay in balance. If one side or the other got too full, it would lead to bad things. Should an enemy village attack and kill some members of their tribe, that village had to be attacked and everybody killed to keep the world in balance. Some people thought Michael Rockefeller was killed because the Dutch had taken over the archipelago, the island, and the men overseeing the colony, Max Lepre, had ordered 5 elite Asmat to be killed. This was either a show of force as a means of controlling the rest of the villages, or these men had violated some edict of Lepre. The Netherlands weren't in any hurry to tell the world that the people living in New Guinea were still eating tourists. Their plan to grant New Guinea their independence was coming along nicely, and this international incident could put a kink in things. No, Michael must have died while still out at sea, and his body was eaten by sharks. Death by misadventure. The Asmat people were warriors, drenched in blood, but Dutch colonial authorities and missionaries had already been in the area for almost a decade by the time Michael had disappeared. The Asmat had never killed any of the white men. The story of Michael being eaten by the locals just didn't add up. He had visited many of their villages and never had any trouble whatsoever. Why would they kill him over something that had happened 3 years earlier? Michael had collected lots of wooden artwork from the Asmat. Anything outside of the tangible immediacy of what the Asmat could see had to come from the spirit world. It was the only comprehensible explanation to them. An airplane seen flying overhead was a passing over canoe of the spirits. White men came from the land beyond the sea, the same place that the spirits lived, and so must be superior beings. They must have thought that Michael was one of the higher spirits, so I don't think he was eaten. He must have drowned. At least that's what the family thought. Anyone interested in what had become of Michael thought the story was finished. That is, until an Australian named Donahue showed up at the Argosy magazine headquarters asking to speak to the editor, Milt Macklin. Donahue said that Michael Rockefeller had not drowned at sea, and he had not been eaten. The Asmat had adopted him into their tribe. Donahue said he had seen Michael while visiting one of the Asmat villages. A tall, white-skinned man had come out of one of the huts and squinted at him. Well, Michael had needed glasses, and he may have lost his during the boat wreck or while he was swimming to shore. Plus, after 9 years, his eyesight may have changed. Donahue told all about his time at the village and the tall white man. He arranged to meet with the editor later that night to give more details. The editor arrived at the hotel where Donahue was staying, only to find that he was no longer there. The Australian had checked out and hadn't left a forwarding location. This was the last time Donahue was heard of or talked about. Macklin was still convinced there was more to the story about Michael than he had drowned or was eaten. He wanted to jump on a plane and fly to New Guinea and begin looking, but he didn't have the time. Instead, Macklin sent a videographer with a camera to have a look around. The story of the videography kind of goes into limbo around this time. Couldn't find any further about it. Most people thought this was just a story made up. Macklin did interview some missionaries who had been on the island at the same time, as well as years after the disappearance. Most of them said that, yes, somebody had told them that they had heard from someone who knew someone else who said that the locals had eaten some white guy back in 1961. In 1974, Macklin wrote a book called The Search for Michael Rockefeller. In it, he said the local headhunters had taken Michael into their tribe as a member, not as a meal. A lot of other researchers said Macklin's book was full of it. No way would the cannibals adopt some white guy. What surprised a lot of folks was a bunch of rolls of 16mm film that had been shot in 1969. That videographer that Macklin had sent to New Guinea, apparently the story wasn't just rumor. The film was never edited or put into a movie. It was shot and left in the cans. Eventually, it was given to a stock footage house. It turned out that a guy who lived in England had the footage stored away in a warehouse. There was no soundtrack, just visual images. The color film showed a bunch of Asmat tribesmen rowing several canoes. Now, these guys didn't row sitting down, they stood up. And these canoes were huge. All of the men in the video, the film, have dark skin. They row out into the bay, and as the boat is passing the camera, one man can be standing in with all of the others, with white skin. He looks to be about the right size and age to be Michael. His face is smeared with war paint, and he has hair, beard, long hair. He never looks towards the camera. Could this be proof that Michael Rockefeller was still alive in 1969, long after the search had been called off? The Rockefeller family was always convinced, or at least they said they were, that the official story of Michael being lost at sea and never making it to shore was how it went. You might think, having all the money in the world, the family would spare no expense trying to locate Michael once the film came to light. Think about how important their image was. They dressed as if they were heading to some formal event just to eat lunch. The public was never allowed to see any member of the family acting like a real person. They always had to look like the elites that they considered themselves to be. If one of the fold wound up running around naked in some far-off island acting like a native, would the family want this kind of publicity? I think the Rockefellers would maintain Michael had drowned at sea and the film was simply ignored, just to maintain their image. Why would the son of the richest man on the planet, the governor of New York, throw away all of his family fortune, his position, his soon-to-be kingdom, to go live with a bunch of cannibals and headhunters? Some people have possessions. Some possessions have people. When Michael was growing up, it was all about keeping the dynasty together. Keep the family wealth in good shape or make it bigger. Any time he was out and about, Michael had to look the part. He was the son of the wealthiest man on earth, and he had to dress and act a certain way. Their possessions had him. Maybe Michael had heard about how all that money was made. People were worked nearly to death just to make profit. Men's lives were swindled away from them in underhanded dealings. People were murdered to keep up the coal mining. The money was all tainted, maybe, as far as Michael was concerned. Maybe he decided the family fortune was nothing but blood money. Having lived amongst the Asmat villagers, Michael may have seen a much simpler way of doing things. No possessions to look after. No possessions to own you. No mansions to keep up. No act to perform any time people are around. He could be himself. How is it people look at some guy who makes $500,000 a year, but his expenses are $550,000 a year? He lives well beyond his means, owing the bank huge sums of money, so he and his family can live in a house they can barely afford, driving cars with payments that will never go away, working too many hours to actually enjoy life, and people think that's a success. On the other hand, somebody living in a trailer that's paid for, making $30,000 a year but only spending $25,000, driving an old beat-up pickup that is paid for, and people look at that like he's an abject failure. What is wrong with the way people look at the world today? I often wonder, often since reading the articles about Michael, did he throw off his civilized trappings? Did he take on the ways of the Asmat, including killing and eating their enemies? We may never know. The mystery of what happened to Michael Rockefeller may never be solved, mostly because there may be some people out there that don't want it to be. I like to keep the show around an hour long. I could only squeeze so much information out of that first story. A lot of it was confusing, a lot of it was contradictory. Well, I got to doing some digging, and I found another famous, although far from wealthy person, who also disappeared. Unfortunately, he was found, and then he did pass away under some very bizarre conditions. September 27th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe departed from Richmond, Virginia on his way to Philadelphia, where he had an editing business and he was scheduled to edit a collection of poems by a well-known poet. Poe never made it to his destination. He seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth. He was found nearly a week later in Baltimore, Maryland, on a rather odd condition. October 3rd, 1849 was election day, and despite the nasty weather at the time, there were a lot of people heading to Gunners Hall in Baltimore, where the ballots were being cast. One of these voters was a man who worked for the Baltimore Sun newspaper named Joseph Walker. Walker was walking past a man laying nearly unconscious in a gutter, dressed in worn-out clothes and babbling and only semi-conscious. Thinking this was just some nameless drunk vagrant, Walker kind of moved to the wall farthest from the gutter to get past this bum. Like watching a train wreck, Walker glanced at the drunk, wondering how anybody could descend to such a level. The face looked oddly familiar. A closer look brought recognition. The man in the gutter was Edgar Allan Poe, who had been reported missing 6 days earlier. Poe was confused, dressed in clothes that were not his and they didn't fit. They were in far worse shape than the author. Walker stopped and moved closer to the man he knew. Poe said something along the lines of Joseph E. Snodgrass or some name that sounded like that. The disoriented and addled Poe said Snodgrass was a magazine editor and had the medical training to know what to do. No Snodgrass was ever found, and Poe would be attended to by a physician named Dr. Moran, who was not able to discern from the author's ramblings where Poe had been, and where he'd gotten those nasty, horrible clothes that he was in, or what had happened to him from the time he disappeared until he was found. The author remained in a state of complete delirium, and was having hallucinations. No one had the faintest idea of what could be wrong with him. October 7th, Poe began yelling about somebody named Reynolds, a name also not connected to him. Later that same day, Edgar Allan Poe died. The official cause of death would eventually be declared swelling of the brain. His strange disappearance and odd behavior in the days leading up to his death have long caused theories to swirl as to what really happened to him, and his death remains just as mysterious as some of his stories. One idea is that he had been beaten by somebody either to rob him or to steal his identity to perform voter fraud, or even willfully targeted him for murder, leaving him in the nasty state that he was found, with his injuries eventually leading to his crazed behavior. There's also the possibility that Poe, famously unable to handle alcohol, had merely had too much to drink. This had led to his bizarre delirious behavior and death. He supposedly had drunk himself to death. This would not be so strange in and of itself, as a single glass of alcohol was said to get him totally smashed. But it still does not explain why he had gone missing for 6 days, or why he had remained incoherent in the days leading up to his death. There was no sign he had been drinking, nor any drugs in his system as far as anyone could tell. Now, keep in mind, forensics were not a thing back then. Other ideas popped up theorizing he'd had a brain tumor, or he had had encephalitis, or maybe meningitis. Another idea was he'd had mercury poisoning, which back then mercury was used as a treatment for a lot of illnesses. Others thought maybe he had contracted rabies. But there is no solid evidence to back up any of these theories. Why did Poe go missing for 6 days? How did a well-known author end up in a gutter in somebody else's clothes? And what caused his bizarre behavior in the days before his death? Who was this Joseph Snodgrass or Reynolds? We may never know, and Edgar Allan Poe's puzzling death is still debated to this day. The mystery of Poe's death is accompanied by the mystery of one of his admirers. Sometime between midnight and 6 a.m., January 19th, Poe's birthday, the Poe toaster paid the writer's memorial site a visit. Every year from 1949, 100 years after Poe's death, until 2009, a man dressed in all black with a wide-brimmed hat and a white scarf would show up at the memorial site. The man would open a bottle of cognac, drink one small glassful, set the bottle down in front of the monument along with 3 red roses, and leave. This toast went on for 60 years. A note would sometimes be left with some writing about the man and his writings, Edgar Allan Poe, that is. As the story of the toaster began to circulate, people would show up at midnight and wait and watch. There was a locked gate, so the onlookers were all outside the grounds. The toaster would come from somewhere in the back of a deconsecrated church. The crowd would politely and respectfully watch this ritual every year. After all, these people were also fans of Edgar Allan Poe. Eventually, somebody did take a photograph of the Poe toaster, but his identity was never obtained. In 1999, a note was left by the memorial stone announcing that the toaster was passing the torch to someone else. 2000, the crowd was bigger as more people showed up wondering if the new Poe toaster would appear. He did, and this continued until 2009. Nothing but questions remain. Who was this mysterious man in black that came to show his regards to a man that he could never have met? Maybe he knew him well from his stories. Why did he drink cognac? Poe never drank the stuff, and none of his stories ever mentioned that particular drink. The 3 roses might have represented the 3 bodies buried there. Poe, his wife Virginia, who was also his cousin, and his mother-in-law, who was also his aunt. Who took over this annual toast? Why did it end in 2009? The Poe toaster was resurrected in 2016, kind of. The Maryland Historical Society held auditions for the Baltimore's next Poe toaster. Someone was picked, and they showed up at Poe's birthday to toast the world-famous writer. The new toaster's name was never released. It's just not the same, though. It's not as mysterious as the original Poe toaster. A 31-year-old Blair Adams of Surrey, British Columbia, Canada, was a friendly, cheerful, and easygoing foreman for a construction company. Things began to get strange in the summer of 1996 when Blair suddenly showed a dramatic change in behavior. The normally cheerful and amiable man became morose, sullen, and withdrawn. He became increasingly paranoid and showed unusually extreme mood swings. When asked about what bothered him, he said that he didn't want to talk about it. Some folks discovered that he believed he was being followed by someone that wanted to kill him. Adams never gave any details on who his nemesis might be or why. His mother, Sandra Edwards, said, "Something was obviously very much the matter. He hadn't been sleeping well. Something was wrong. I asked him numerous times what was wrong, and he said, 'I don't think I should tell you about it.' And to this day, I don't know what it was." July 5th, 1996, Blair emptied his safe deposit box of $6,000 in cash, some jewelry, and some gold. He headed for the Canadian-American border, where he was acting bizarre and they didn't allow him into the United States. The following day, he went to work and he quit his job before purchasing a ticket for Frankfurt, Germany, on a flight that was scheduled to leave the next day. Despite having bought his expensive ticket, Blair once again made a beeline for the border, this time trying to enlist the help of a friend who he told someone is trying to kill him. The friend was unable to help, and the next day Blair missed his flight to Germany, and he tried once again to enter the United States. This time he managed to get into Seattle, Washington. In Seattle, his bizarre behavior continued. He bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Upon arriving in D.C., he rented a car and he began driving to Knoxville, Tennessee. In Knoxville, things continued to spiral into the weird when Blair came to a gas station and told the attendant that his car wouldn't start. It was determined that he had been trying to use the wrong key to start the car. Adams hitched a ride and ended up at a hotel, where he also did some strange things. One employee said, "The best way to describe him would be paranoid. He just was very nervous, agitated, expecting somebody to come in on him, even though there wasn't anybody there. I don't know who he was looking for, but he was waiting for somebody to come for him." Blair walked in and out of the lobby 5 times before actually paying for his room. When he finally got his key, he walked out the door and disappeared again. He was never seen alive again. 12 hours later, Blair's body was found naked from the waist down in a parking lot less than a mile from the hotel. On the ground around him was $4,000 of American, Canadian, and German currency. Also, there were gold coins and jewelry laying on the ground. The only thing on his lower body were his socks, which were turned inside out. None of his missing clothing was ever found. An autopsy report said that his body displayed injuries consistent with trying to fight someone off, and he had been killed by a powerful blow to the abdomen. Why did he think somebody was trying to kill him? It would appear he was right, but nobody knows who or why. He had no known enemies, and he was reported to be a well-liked person amongst his friends and co-workers. Why did he buy a ticket to Germany and change some of his money into Deutschmarks? He didn't know anybody in Germany, and he didn't have a visa to get into the country. For my foreign listeners, once in the United States, he flew from Seattle to Washington, D.C., about 2,700 miles. He could have flown straight to Knoxville from Seattle, 2,550 miles. Save a lot of time and hassle in Washington. He rented a car and he drove to Tennessee. Once again, he didn't know anybody living there either. What happened to the keys to his rental car? The key that he had went to a different vehicle. His pants, underwear, and shoes vanished and never turned up. His socks were inside out. Who, or maybe what, punched him with enough force to rupture internal organs? Had this been just a robbery, the money, jewelry, and precious metals would have gone missing. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Nobody knows what was going on in Adams' life that drove him to run away, and his killer is still out there somewhere. September 2009, 24-year-old college student Matrice Richardson set out on a drive up the coast of California from Long Beach to Malibu. She drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, meandering along the seashore. At some point after arriving in Malibu, she went to a fancy restaurant, parked her car, and then went and sat in the car belonging to the valet. The owner of the car asked her what she was doing, to which she said something about a woman named Vanessa with tattoos on her arms, asking the valet if he knew her. When asked why she'd gotten into the car, she merely stated, "It's subliminal," and then she went into the restaurant. She ordered a very expensive meal, but rather than eat, she wandered over to the next table and began trying to elbow her way into the group, joining into their conversation, saying strange, nonsensical things about Michael Jackson's death, and she talked about astrology. As the entire group gave her a questioning look, Matrice asked if they knew this mysterious woman, Vanessa. She kept moving back and forth between her own table and the one beside her as her ramblings became increasingly more confusing. Then she began to giggle uncontrollably. When her dinner was finished, she tried to leave with the group without paying for her own meal. And when she was stopped by the staff, she said that she was from the planet Mars and she was willing to pay for her meal with favors. Matrice was a well-educated honors psychology student at Cal State Fullerton, had never been known to do drugs or engage in bizarre behavior. She had been diagnosed as bipolar, but it was under control until that night. The police were called and they found there were empty bottles of alcohol and marijuana paraphernalia in Matrice's car. Thinking this young woman was high or drunk or both, she was taken into custody and booked. At the station, she was given a breathalyzer. There was no alcohol in her system. Her actions were no longer suspicious, as she was acting clear-headed and sober. An officer had called Matrice's mother, who asked the authorities to please keep her daughter at the station overnight for her own good. Other than failure to pay for her meal, they had no reason to hold her, so Matrice was allowed to walk. Her car had been impounded, and it had her identification, her purse, and her cell phone in it. She set out on foot from the police station. After her release, the strange behavior continued. One resident in the area reported seeing a woman matching Matrice's description going around the neighborhood for some time. She would go up and look in people's windows, look in all the windows that she could get to, and then move on to the next house and continue this activity. The police were called, a report of a peeping Tom, but when they arrived they couldn't find Matrice. It was as if she had walked off the face of the earth. Nearly a year later, August 9th, 2010, her decomposing and partially mummified body turned up in a secluded wilderness area called Dark Canyon. It was up in the Santa Monica Mountains, about 7 miles from the station where she had been released from. There were no signs of blunt trauma or stab wounds, which led authorities to conclude there were no signs of foul play, as she had probably fallen to her death. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. To add a lot of questions to the report, the sheriff's deputies had moved the remains without following standard protocols. The coroner hadn't been called until after the body had been removed. The family wasn't notified they had found Matrice until days later. Now I can see how there could be a delay in notifying the family until the body could be properly identified, but the standard procedure is for the coroner to check things over before the body is tagged and bagged. Nobody could figure out why she wound up out there in the mountains in the first place. Had she thumbed a ride from somebody, or did she walk, stumbling around with no real direction? Where had she been in the year since she had last been seen before she died? Her clothes were found over 100 feet from her body. The official report said that scavengers had removed the clothing to get to her body. There were no bite marks, no scratch marks anywhere. The clothing had been removed by someone. The buttons were all unbuttoned, the belt had been unbuckled, the zipper was unzipped, and everything was in a nice, neat little pile. Had it been scavengers, the clothing would simply have been everywhere around the body. The case held other mysteries as well, such as why the body had become mummified and why the clothing showed no signs of wear consistent with having been in the elements for 11 months. You leave a pile of clothing on the side of a mountain for a year, it's going to get kind of damaged just from the elements. The position of the body's arm was also an anomaly, as it had mummified across the chest at a weird angle. Had Matrice fell to her death, her arm would have been forced away from her body. There was nothing present to hold the arm in such a position. It was defying gravity. Why hadn't the authorities kept her for longer rather than releasing an obviously troubled woman back out into the night on her own, despite the fact that the young woman's mother had specifically requested police keep her at least overnight? The mishandling of the body, the eyebrow-raising official prognosis, and Matrice's early release from detention were indeed suspicious enough for the family of the victim to suspect that law enforcement officials may have been doing something unlawful. They requested the FBI look into the department while filing several wrongful death lawsuits against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. The FBI refused to look into the case, saying that it was not in their jurisdiction. There has never been an internal investigation or a probe into the department, and there has been very little action at all taken since the discovery of the body on the part of the authorities. It is still treated as a death rather than a homicide, despite the family's objections. As far as mishandling of any potential evidence goes, nobody involved with the handling of the case has ever been prosecuted or even investigated. A family friend thinks there is some form of a cover-up going on. Matrice was acting in a bizarre manner. This could be explained by her bipolar condition. Who put the empty booze bottles in her car? Her family said Matrice didn't smoke marijuana. Well, I know people do things without their family knowing it. Marijuana has a sedentary effect. People call it getting high, but you're actually in a depressed or a reduced state. I've seen quite a few folks having smoked dope, and they never act manic. Mostly they're just happy and they want to eat snacks. There's much anecdotal evidence from people with bipolar disorders that suggests that the use of marijuana is actually beneficial for the symptoms of this condition. It is a bizarre world we live in. People do things that the rest of us may think is crazy. And next time you see somebody acting in an exotic manner, try and find out if they're actually okay before writing them off as simply being drunk, high, or stupid, especially if it's a friend of yours. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell the world what they're missing. If your friend walks away and leaves his computer unattended, call up the show, Strange Things with Chris James, and hit play. Maybe they'll thank you later. If you want to buy one of my books, you can find everything at Amazon.com. And if you'd like a t-shirt, not this one, but a t-shirt from Strange Things, you can get them at tpublic.com. Now, I know the show is brought to you by Organic Man Coffee. Gunnar Monson has been on the show in the past. He's talked about Bigfoot out in Oregon, so I thought I'd give him a little publicity. You can't beat a good cup of coffee. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.